Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of This Week in Global Development. I'll be your host for this week. My name is Rumbi Chakamba, and I'm joined by Dave Ainsworth and Anna Gawel. Thanks, guys, for joining me. So after weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of speculation about what will happen to USAID, the Trump administration has finally submitted a plan to abolish, and this is their word, abolish USAID to Congress. There are not many surprises because it's in line with a previous plan that was circulating in Washington, D.C., which is said to have been written by Trump administration aides. But Anna, can you take us through what we've learned from this new plan?
Sure. And like you said, abolish is the formal term that they use. USAID as, quote, an independent establishment, and they would merge its programs and functions into the State Department. So this plan came with an outline of how to implement the merger. Specifically, there would be an Office of Global Food Security, which would encompass food security and humanitarian assistance programs. There would be, I forget the exact name, but a Bureau of Global Health to manage USAID's health programming, including its HIV/AIDS programming as well. Then the key thing is that all remaining USAID programs would be managed by an Office of Foreign Assistance within each of the State Department's regional bureaus, which would also absorb USAID's regional bureau. So basically, USAID's Africa Bureau will now be overseen by State Department's Bureau of African Affairs. Meanwhile, anything that the administration determined was duplicative of State Department's work will be eliminated. And as we know from our prior reporting, it's a pretty sizable amount of programs that will be eliminated, officially 86%, though the numbers depends on how you count them and how you look at them. Theoretically, the other big kind of part of it is that it would eliminate substantially all of USAID's employees and kind of conduct a new process for recruiting talent. But so theoretically, this could mean that you are rehiring some terminated USAID staff, but that is a big question mark. The plan explicitly said that we don't know if that's what it means. So there's still a lot of questions, but at least there is a plan on the table on the proposal, and you can debate the merits of it. But there is at least something that, like you said, ended weeks and weeks of speculation.
I hear a lot of people saying that, but at least we now know. And Dave, you've been covering USAID for a very long time and also overseeing our coverage of USAID. Are you surprised by this outcome? Because I think we went through a time when we were talking about, is it possible to save the agency? And now it's looking like that's a pretty much a no, and we're now discussing what comes next.
Yeah, I think we went through a period of kind of existential angst and despair when people thought that essentially no aid left. It looked for a while as if they were pretty much just planning on taking a hatchet to the whole aid establishment. They weren't going to spend any money on development at all. Everyone was going to lose their jobs. All of the development implementers would go out of business, and it would be pretty calamitous. And I spoke to a couple of people in the last week who kind of said, it's still not very good. In fact, it's still very bad, but it's a lot better than we thought it was going to be. So they're in a weird sort of mood, really, because obviously it's a disaster for the aid establishment, but it's a much smaller disaster than they thought it was. They thought it was going to be a calamity. It's merely very bad. So I think I'm not surprised at all that they decided to get rid of USAID. I think quite early on in the process, it looked like USAID was pretty much a goner. But I don't want to say pleasantly surprised, because it's not a pleasant surprise, but this is a substantial improvement, I think, on where we could have been. And there are questions over some of the workability of some of the technical aspects of this. I think we're not necessarily quite across all the technical aspects of it to understand exactly where the fault lines lie. I know there are some people in the aid sector who've worked with USA for a lot longer than any of us have, who are questioning some of the kind of nuance of it. But it does look like a much more workable proposal. So it's hard to describe exactly how you feel about it. It's like going into the house for a baby and coming out with a cat.
Okay. Well, anyway, when you start at zero and you end up with a cat, that's a lot better. If you're expecting a baby and you end up with a cat, that's a question mark. But if you're expecting nothing and you end up with a cat, that's a lot better. Dave sort of spoke about some of like the criticisms. Anna, what are some of the criticisms that we're hearing about this particular proposal? What's been submitted to Congress?
Yeah, it could be, that you're layering a bureaucracy on top of a bureaucracy, essentially. I mean, this idea of integrating State Department, USAID into State Department is not new. It's been floating around for years. And when you think about it on the surface, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to kind of align everything under one foreign policy umbrella, kind of avoid the fragmentation, the siloing of different programs. So there's certainly an argument to be made in terms of maximizing efficiency, effectiveness. But the counter argument is that diplomacy and development are two very different things with different skill sets of people. Diplomacy, involves kind of more transactional political wins. They tend to think on a more short-term basis. They deal directly with foreign governments, whereas development deals with all kinds of actors, not just foreign governments. It tends to think long term for society's prosperity. It's less transactional in its approach, and it also involves a lot more technical expertise and technical specialists to implement a lot of these programs. So you've got experts in not just particular countries, but like different sectors. So health, education, democracy promotion. That's a big criticism is even if you're merging USAID into the State Department, you fired thousands of USAID contractors and direct hires. So your technical capacity that's left over is incredibly limited, and that's not a natural skill set for diplomats within the State Department. So that's an issue they're going to have to reconcile.
A lot of people have been talking about the USAID workforce and that we've gotten rid of all these people. They're not going to stay put. They're probably going to move on, and we're missing this technical expertise. And in line and around the same time that we got this proposal submitted to Congress, we also heard what's going to happen to the remaining staff at USAID. Basically, everyone's going to be terminated either by July or September, and they have an option of staying on to sort of help with the final days of USAID and everything that needs to be dismantled, or they just go on administrative leave. And then they have to start a new process then of hiring people within the State Department. But I imagine that you can't hire the entire workforce because we're trying to be smaller, more lean, and I imagine a lot of people are going to be out of work. And Anna, you're in DC where the majority of these people are located. How are they taking this?
It's really hard. I mean, my own kind of speculation on this is that the DC economy, which tends to be pretty robust, will be in a painful position the months and years to come, because we're talking not just 10 or 13,000 USAID employees, but you just had 10,000 health and human services workers who've been fired or laid off and so forth. So it's pretty grim because this is a government town. And I think, like, as you said, a really key point that you made is even if you rehire people, it's not going to be everybody. It's an entire process to hire and join the government. It's not an easy process. I mean, I assume it'll be somewhat easier if you've already got that relevant experience, but it's still not a quick and easy process. And again, I think the other key thing is to remember is the timing. When will all of this happen? This proposal that came out was not clear other than September, but even then, it's like, will hiring start in September? Will you wait a little while longer? And in the meantime, people are out of work. And you've lost that trust factor in terms of, well, if I applied for the government, will I get fired tomorrow again? So people will have moved on. And I think, there are certainly people who this is their passion, or they will not have found another job, who will reapply. But that's a huge, huge question mark. And being here in DC, it's a pretty grim mood, I would describe it as.
And it's actually a bit of a huge gamble. Dave, I want to come to you because we're losing all these staffers. In addition to that, programs cannot run, I imagine. We've canceled a lot of programs, and programs cannot run without these staffers. So it's a bit of a huge gamble. What do you think this impact will be?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, they've made a complete mess of this. Like we saw, they paused programs, then they terminated programs, then they issued a bunch of waivers, then they issued a bunch of terminations, then they decided to start again. We're still getting messages from people. We've been going through the list of cancelled government programs, terminated programs, and we're still getting messages from people who are running $100 million, $200 million programs who are saying, actually, our program hasn't been cancelled at all. They got it wrong. It's just an error. So they've very little idea what they're doing. And a lot of people, I'm at the Skoll World Forum right now. I'm talking to some people who are closely involved in this. And they're saying, we think they just kind of got AI, they got some kind of search and replace function, and they went through the list looking at the programs. They don't really quite know what they cut. But yeah, to come to your question, that they cannot run these programs without thousands of people. Setting up a USAID program and delivering it is a really incredibly labor intensive piece of work. There's so many federal regulations, so many pieces of legislation have been passed by Congress that you have to comply with in order to do everything properly. And that just takes a huge amount of people, and people with a lot of skills. A lot of these guys are managing like huge portfolios of programs. It's an incredibly stressful and difficult thing to do. And I think they're going to start up a lot of these programs again, right? It looks as if the focus is going to narrow. We're going to be looking at just food, humanitarian, health for the most part. But that's more than half of the work of USAID, really. Or at least, like, those things touch more than half of the work of USAID. And in order to restart those programs and to start actually making new awards, they're going to need thousands of people. Really, it looks, and the skills required to do that are so particular, so precise, that I think it's going to be hard to get people from outside of the development sector who know how to do it. So I would have to guess that they're going to end up just hiring back a lot of the same folk, having just unaccountably really wound them up.
Which will bring us to the question, why did we have to go through all this to begin with? But we'll give it a chance. We'll give it a chance and see what actually happens. So prior to this proposal that we saw last week, there had been many other proposals floating around, which kind of looked at what should happen. I think people took this as an opportunity that things are changing. Let's try and weigh in as much as possible and maybe influence what's going to come next. And one of the things that was mentioned in several proposals was that putting all this under the Secretary of State just does not seem feasible. Like you mentioned, Dave, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of programs, and having just this one person overseeing this and then overseeing the diplomacy side of things just does not seem feasible. Are there any other elements that don't seem feasible, or any other points that we picked up from the various proposals that are floating around that seem like they should be something that the government is considering?
Yeah, I think, on the point that you mentioned, a lot of these proposals seem to have in common that they would install a deputy secretary of state who would have kind of that gravitas to be at the State Department, to be the number two, if you will. Maybe not number two, however they do the arrangement. But the point is, you would have like a role akin to a USAID administrator who would have that voice. And again, so that way you are consolidating, but still continuing to distinguish between the two agencies, but entities, if you will. But I mean, a lot of these proposals were in favor of consolidation. But again, they all seem to go back to respecting the functions that USAID can itself do uniquely. And the technical capability is something that a lot of these proposals all talked about, and how maintaining that is the only way to kind of maintain this system. Like Dave said, you're talking about thousands of people who've been doing this for many, many years. I think sometimes the other thing that the proposals seem to all mention is kind of cutting out the middlemen, these for-profit contractors, multilaterals, the big international NGOs, which, is not anything that brand new. You talk about localization. It's about getting more direct buy-in from local actors, national governments abroad, and so forth. So some of that isn't new. But again, I think it's the speed with which and the dramatic just nature of how this was all done. So you cut out the middleman in a lot of ways. These contractors, lost a ton of programming, but you also cut out the direct hires. You cut USAID itself to the bone. So I think basically the one thing that these proposals have in common is that some of these elements are good, but they shouldn't be that extreme. There should be some more care taken to implement them.
Which reminds me of something really profound that I read on LinkedIn. I can't remember whose post this was, but it was a USAID former employee now who is speaking about how she's lost her job, but her biggest concern is like the recipients on the ground and how much they're going to suffer as a result of this loss of expertise, as well as like the posing of programs. And her sort of plea was she wishes that people had gone on the ground and actually seen the work that USAID does and gone gotten a sort of appreciation of what it is and how much work it takes and the expertise that are needed before sort of taking this sort of machete approach to removing aid. But one thing Anna mentioned that I found really interesting was localization, because there's been this fear among local actors. USAID has been championing localization. They set targets. We're moving towards them, not fast enough for some people, but moving towards them. And there's this fear that this is something that's completely going to be ignored after this point. What's your take on that, Dave? Are we still going to see localization as part of the agenda, do you think?
I mean, this is an excellent opportunity to build a local first funding system. If you knock everything down and start again, you really do have the opportunity to build something that's really focused on local leadership. And I've been hearing a lot of proposals about how to do it. Essentially, you would use something called country-based pooled funds as one possible vehicle, where you have an in-country grant giver kind of answers to USAID, but it gives lots of small grants to lots of small organizations who are delivering what USAID wants. And that would be a really effective way of actually getting funding to the front line. And it sounds like a really good idea. And I think there's absolutely zero chance that it's going to happen. I think it's going to be completely ignored. I don't think it's anywhere close to the top of the agenda of the people in Washington right now. I don't think that there's sufficient expertise among the people who are designing the system to come up with anything like this. I don't think there's any desire to do anything kind of radical at all. Broadly, we have seen consolidation of aid departments into their kind of parent government departments, including in the United Kingdom, my home country. And I think it has rarely turned out to be a good idea for the development sector. It's typically come to lead to a loss of expertise, a loss of focus, a loss of independence, and it really has not kind of, I mean, it might have achieved a number of the goals of the individuals who are kind of trying to get things to, it might have achieved a lot of the goals of the guys in government who want to consolidate control for whatever reason, but it's rarely good for the development sector. And I think another problem here is that localization needs more staff in USAID, right? If you're going to localize services, you need to give smaller grants. You need to have more people on the ground in the country. The reason that we have all these huge implementers working with USAID in DC and whatever is because basically they've had to take on the risk for USAID. USAID has been very, very risk averse because of all the rules that have been laid down by Congress. And it has basically gone out to people and said, are you able to take on the risk of this contract for us? And only people who are professionals are taking on risk for USAID. People who have a multi-million-dollar department that's designed to do that, only they can do that. So unless there is legislative reform to kind of accompany this kind of bureaucratic reform, I can't see any way that we're actually going. They're clearly at this stage, there is an opportunity. You easily could increase the amount of local funding. I think we all know, or many people in the aid community have practical ideas about how to do it. And I think we understand how to implement it, and I would give it basically a 0% chance of happening.
You know, if I could interject, I think what's interesting is prior to the election, you had a lot of moderate Republicans who were, you know, kind of dissecting the idea of restructuring USAID, foreign aid in general. And for instance, we talk a lot about this Project 2025 blueprint. You know, we talked to the author of the USAID chapter, Max Primorak, and, you know, they were very pro localization because it's seen as something that's both cost effective and just more effective in general. So, but now you're seeing a lot of the local employees, they don't know what's going on. They've been fired. There's a whole mess of local labor laws that, you know, everyone's kind of trying to figure out. So like Dave said, there was really this potential for localization among a lot of these moderate conservative proposals, but that seems to, in this machete wielding approach, has gotten lost.
Yeah, that's something I should have said actually, is that if you pause everybody's funding for a couple of months, the people in DC probably survive. They've got 3 months of reserves. They've got some ability to access capital. They've got access to like professional finance staff who can kind of identify where they can cut. The local organizations have nothing in reserve. They're living on a shoestring. They all go bust. So by the time they get this back up and running, the local organizations will either have lost interest and gone elsewhere, or they'll be effectively out of business. And they certainly won't be in much of a mood to do business with the USAID, I don't think. Like, they're going to be pretty risk averse, and like once bitten, twice shy is where they're going to be.
Which is a really sad situation to go to. I want to jump ship and go to Skoll, but before that, Anna, I had one more question for you. This proposal has been submitted to Congress as part of a budget. What options does Congress then have? Because I feel like that's a voice that's been missing.
That's an excellent point, and we may start to see things turn around. The fact that the Trump administration this was notified Congress of its intentions could signal in and of itself that it's going to wait and listen to lawmakers and weigh their responses. And so I think that that is the opportunity for lawmakers to come into this and really finally have more of an opinion and maybe more of a say. But I have to add a huge caveat to that, which is the Trump administration at the same time is not known for waiting around for Congress. You know, it prides itself on acting boldly, acting unilaterally. So on the one hand, you do have this somewhat firm proposal. You've got the July 1st first phase deadline, September 2nd deadline. That's going to be when the budget's really going to be debated. So theoretically, you've got more congressional involvement, and also it's important to remember that Republicans control both houses of Congress. So if they all vote to abolish USAID, then it's very feasible that it would happen. But if not, if there are complications, will the Trump administration just move ahead with doing this? We could potentially see that. And here that brings us back to that fundamental question of, are we in a kind of constitutional type crisis here because Congress created USAID. So legally, you need new legislation to abolish it, to eliminate the agency. Will the administration listen? That's kind of the big question. We still don't know. But it is a good sign. It is it does send a certain signal, the fact that they have submitted this to Congress along with the list of terminated and active programs. There's at least that more interaction taking place.
Although it kind of feels like you could probably abolish it in everything but name without Congress's assistance. But Dave, I want to jump to you. You're at the Skoll Forum this week. And one thing that really fascinated me about your time there last year was you described it as a forum for not the traditional aid donors, but people who are looking at how aid should change and people who are looking at doing things differently. And this is a great opportunity to be discussing how things should be done differently. What are sort of the discussions that are happening there, and what are some of the key players that are involved in the forum?
Yeah, it's really interesting this year. So Skoll is a fascinating place. Anyway, I'm always fascinated to be here at Skoll. It's kind of, there's a mixture of what they call donors and doers. So the forum's really driven by sort of mid-sized philanthropic organizations. There's some really big ones here, some mega foundations, but also a lot of smaller family foundations. And then alongside them, there's a real diversity of kind of social enterprises, innovative charities, a lot of organizations from the global south here. It's also very much an American conference in Oxford, in England, which is a very interesting kind of experience for me. I'm in my hometown, my home country, but I'm also surrounded by a bunch of people from all over the world. And American accents are very much in the majority this year, I think even more than normal. So the discussions that are taking place here, it's not surprising, it is very dominated by the change of behavior of the big donors and how that's having a trickle-down effect right the way through to everybody else. So even though a lot of people here don't get a lot of money from USAID, a lot of people here are independently wealthy and are giving their own cash to small organizations, they're all feeling this giant kind of wash of this tidal wave of money that's sloshed in and is sloshing out again and is leaving them in a very different situation. So the philanthropists are thinking hard about, do we give more? Should we be changing our strategy? And I think a lot of them were really taken by surprise when they first encountered when this first happened, and they were left with a kind of stunned expression on their face. I wouldn't describe philanthropists necessarily as quick thinkers, quick responders. Generally speaking, they like to deliberate, they like to take their time. And I think they've now had a couple of months, and a lot of them are kind of now saying to themselves, they've had a few board meetings, they've sat down and thought about it, and they're like, yeah, I think we are going to spend a bit more. And we've certainly heard some people come out and outright say, we're going to spend more. Jeff Skoll, the founder of the Skoll Conference and the Skoll Foundation, has come out and said, I'm going to give more money. We've heard from the MacArthur Foundation. They came out quite quickly and said they were going to give more money, but they kind of reiterated that on the stage here yesterday. And we heard a lot of other philanthropists kind of not kind of commit to a dollar figure, but definitely kind of go, yeah, it's time for everybody to step up here. I think John Paul Freed from the MacArthur Foundation said he thinks that one of the main reasons why more people aren't committing to like saying we're going to give more is because you do get a lot of emails in your inbox if you're a philanthropist and you suggest that you're going to hand out a bit more money. Otherwise, though, people are thinking really quite hard about what this means for them. There's an interesting trend among a lot of people from the global south who are kind of talking to each other about this as an opportunity and saying, look, obviously we'd rather have the money, but we have been in this kind of aid-dependent mindset, sitting around like baby birds with their beaks in the air, just kind of going, give us aid, give us cash, give us cash, give us cash. And now that opportunity is not available, it's an opportunity to have a dialogue with your own government about kind of how else those services might be delivered. And a lot of people are thinking hard about kind of what that means. Everyone at Skoll is an incurable optimist, right? It's quite tiring actually to hang around with them, really, because they're all very high energy, very optimistic, making the world a better place. Everyone's buzzing with enthusiasm, but they're all feeding off each other as well, like building up into this kind of paroxysm of kind of energy about how everything's going to be. And so it's not surprising that they're putting the best possible light on it, but they do seem to be seeing some definite opportunities here. Listening to people talk. Go ahead. I've been talking for a long
I was going to say, I have heard a lot of discussions about governments in the global south needing to take more responsibility and how this is an opportunity that might actually push them to do that. And I think we're beginning to hear, initially, we published a story actually today on Uganda and how they're running out of HIV drugs. And initially, recipients were sympathetic with their government that you've just been left in the lurch. We can understand what's going on. But a few months down their line, they're like, you should actually be figuring this out. You should be the ones providing this. But when you think about the sheer amount of money that the US government was spending on foreign aid, you think about philanthropy, you think about government stepping up, there's always this question that can it be enough? And it seems like it cannot be enough right now. Maybe in the long term, that's possible. But right now, to cover that gap seems like an impossible feat. Is there an acknowledgement of that, or is there just this optimism that let's do this, we can do this?
I think that I've certainly spoken to some other people who said, look, this is bravado. Like, there's 10,000 jobs or whatever it is lost in Zambia. Like, we can't just replace those overnight. It's going to have a huge knock-on effect on the economy. People are going to struggle. Local governments are not going to be able to just find this cash really, really quickly. Definitely all over the world, talking to people from everywhere, my fellow Europeans as well, there is a little bit of a, okay, the Americans have gone crazy. We're going to deal without them. Like, this is probably good for us. We should be standing on our own 2 feet anyway, not listening to somebody else tell us how to live our lives. And so there's certainly an enthusiasm for independence, but also I think the more realistic minded individuals are looking at this going, yeah, okay, maybe there's an opportunity in the longer term, but in the short term, things really are going to struggle. It's also interesting to sit and listen to a couple of other trends emerging from this. People talking about, well, how are we going to redesign it? We've got a blank sheet of paper. I sat down and listened to Gawel Smith, the former USAID administrator, talk about it's a blank sheet of paper here at Skoll, and what are we going to write on it? After a while of discussion, I was left with the feeling that really they still had a blank sheet of paper at the end of the day, and nobody quite knew quite how we were going to go about it. And the other really interesting discussion that's been taking place here is about how are we going to talk about this? Good grief, we've lost the public here. We've failed to make the case for aid. How did we drop the ball on this? And people are starting to have that discussion as well. How do we talk about that differently? But I think that's going to be a really difficult journey when you listen to people talk about it. I think the development sector, particularly here, has been conditioned to talk a little bit in donorese, in the language of the grant application, and translating that back into kind of English to talk to ordinary people who don't know anything about aid. It's really surprisingly challenging, I think. And it does seem to be something that people are really struggling with, realizing that they're kind of breathing slightly rarefied air here. and that they're going to, if they want to make the case for the work that they're doing, they have to speak a different language to a different group of people, and that's not easy to do.
I think we lost Rumbi for a second, but I was going to kind of follow up on what Dave, what you said and what Rumbi had said. Is another important thing to remember about philanthropies and why they can't necessarily plug that gap is the fact that they also rely on some of this public money. You know, Gates partners with USAID, so do quite a number of philanthropies. They use that money to catalyze more investment. So they too are hit. It's a kind of interwoven, very delicate ecosystem. And when you take $40 billion out, everybody feels it. And then, of course, philanthropies are, you know, the demand is up for them and for every dime that they can possibly give. And one person I spoke to, I don't have the privilege of being at Skoll, so you'll have to feel, you know, I have to live vicariously through you. But one advisor I spoke to, advisor to a family foundation, said their strategy right now is strategic patience. You know, it's waiting and seeing. I think we forget how quickly all of this is manifested. Like, it's been barely 2.5 months, or, you know, I can't even keep track. So I was saying, Rumbi, you know, a lot of philanthropies are waiting to see what happens. I don't think, you know, they tend to be risk averse. And I think you've got the time constraint, you've got this timeline that doesn't fit with a lot of NGOs who need the money right now. But the fact is, philanthropies operate on a different timeline. And so I think we're going to see this bit of kind of like what I heard, strategic patience play out in the months ahead. And that's going to be to the frustration of people who need the money right away.
Yeah, I can.
Please
Go ahead, Dave.
I mean, the other thing to say is that they just don't have enough money, right? For every dollar that the American government gives to development, like philanthropy gives what, a nickel, a dime? Like, there's just not anywhere near enough cash for the philanthropic sector to plug the gap. And these people are talking about increasing their spending by 20% a year. That's a penny compared to a dollar that's been lost. And I think realistically that I think the philanthropy sector is going to step up, but they're going to instead of contributing 5 cents to the dollar of what the US government was contributing, they're now going to be producing 6 cents to the dollar, 7 cents to the dollar. And I don't know how much difference people are going to see as a result of that, which is not to say that's not the right thing to do. Broadly, people here seem to have come to the consensus that it is, but you can't replace USAID.
I think that's a big point to highlight. You can't replace USAID. And which brings me back to you, Anna. So what should we be on the lookout for in the coming weeks with results to what happens to USAID and what happens to US foreign policy as a whole?
I think one thing we didn't mention is these lawsuits that are ongoing. They've kind of, there's this lull, but when you do these massive reduction in force, what they call it, RIFs, basically firing people, you may start to see some lawsuits, new lawsuits emerging from that, you know, that this process was done very hastily, you know, it didn't take into account performance reviews or things along those lines. So I do think we're not done with the lawsuits, and that's an important point. But I do think, you know, it's going to be moving very fast. There is this plan in place now. I can see where the administration is very set in its ways, and they're going to start implementing it. And I think most of, you know, come July 1st, which is only, you know, a few months away, majority of staff will be gone. The other staff is there essentially to wind down operations by September 2nd. And again, I think with Republicans in control of both houses, unless you start to really get that moderate Republican pushback that tends to have always had this bipartisan support for foreign aid, I don't know that you're going to have it this time around. So this plan could pretty much be what we're going, at least the outlines of it will be what we see moving forward in the months ahead. I think there's a strong chance of that happening, but still so many unknowns.
Another thing I meant to say, actually, and I talked a lot about what's happening here at Skoll already, is that actually, again, people are a lot more optimistic than they were a month ago about the amount of aid spending they expect to see from the United States government. So I think if you'd gone around and said how, like, for every dollar that USAID spent last year, how much would you expect they're going to spend next year? If you'd asked everybody like a month ago, I think they'd have said 20 cents on the dollar or something like that. Now, I've asked quite a few people this, and they're saying 50%, 60% is going to be saved. Obviously, it's a little bit asking people to guess the length of the Emperor of China's nose, right? Nobody actually knows, so maybe it doesn't matter how much consensus you build. But generally speaking, the vibe seems to be, well, no, they could produce sort of 65% of the spending that they were producing before. That would obviously still not be fantastic for the aid community, especially because like they've stopped and then they've restarted, which has destroyed a lot of value for good. But I think it's better than we thought it was going to be just a few weeks ago.
On that hopeful note, we're better than where we were a few weeks ago. Dave, I'm actually looking forward to your roundup of Skoll. I really enjoyed last year's story. I hope we have something similar this year. And to our audience, you should be on the lookout for that. And we'll obviously continue to cover the USAID story, and anything that emerges, I will be on the lookout for that. So please keep checking our Devex website and sign up to our newsletters to get the stories right in your inbox. Thanks, guys, for joining me.